Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the South America podcast. From the Andes to the Amazon and almost to Antarctica. Please like and subscribe to continue receiving notifications about this podcast and other activities on this channel. I'm hoping to bring more scholastic and artistic content to the wider community. Enough about that. Dr. Simon Overall, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself? Who are you and where do you work?
Hi, thanks, Austin. My name is Simon Overall, as you have mentioned. I work at Ōtākou Whakaihu Waka, or University of Otago, which is in Dunedin, New Zealand.
Fantastic. And so which department are you in?
I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of English and Linguistics.
Fantastic. But you don't work on English at the moment, do you?
Absolutely not. My specialty area is Amazonian languages, particularly those of the Northwest Amazon. So I am very firmly on the linguistics side of the English and Linguistics program.
Fantastic. So how does one get into Amazonian linguistics? And specifically, not just one, but how did you get into Amazonian linguistics? Did you start just with linguistics, or did the South America bug bite early, or how did it all happen?
I started with linguistics, and I'm glad that you narrowed the question down, because I don't know generally how one gets into it, but I can tell you how I got into it. I loved languages, and I studied languages in high school, and also enrolled in some languages when I started university, but I've never been particularly gifted with learning to speak languages. I forget the words and I trip over my tongue, but I always loved the patterns and the grammar. And so I started studying linguistics at university and just went, yes, this is what I want to do. I love this. And it wasn't until I was looking for a PhD project that I sort of came to the idea that, I could do a grammatical description of a language. I could do this fieldwork based project, and that was inspired by Bob Dixon, who's the great Australianist, and he'd written about the importance of doing a grammar writing fieldwork based PhD.
So just for people who might not be familiar, when a linguist says, I'm writing a grammar of a particular language, what does that mean? What does that entail? Because I think some people think of grammar, they go, okay, I know it's sort of the rules of the language, they think, right? But what does that mean to write an entire grammar of a language, of like a language system, as it were?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a term that we throw around as linguists that's not always obvious to a non-linguist. And I think possibly a better way to label it would be simply a description of the language. So what we're aiming to do is describe the language in its entirety. So from the system of sounds, looking at the details of, when we pronounce the T sound, is the tongue touching the back of the teeth or not? Is that vowel nasal or not? And then right through looking at the word classes, looking at our nouns and verbs and adjectives. Does the language have adjectives? These are the questions we want to answer. And then looking at the rules of the type that you might have come across if you've learned a language where you have to conjugate your verbs and decline your nouns and so on. And then right through to how is the language used in the culture? What sort of stories do people tell? What sort of is there a tradition of proverbs or of particular song styles? All of these questions we want to answer. So it's extremely broad in terms of what we want to cover, but it's also narrow in that we're looking at one language. We're saying this is the language we're going to describe.
Yeah, definitely. I think, if you don't mind me sharing, you and I were talking over the summer, actually, in person in Peru, actually, about this process of writing a grammar. And of course, I think you'd recommend it as a great exercise, and as a great way of understanding. Sorry.
It really is.
Yeah. To anyone who's done it or read any, you see the effort that goes into it. But I think you and I also ironically narrowed in on what is sometimes seen as quite a vague term, which is that, to some extent, writing a grammar is finding out the vibe of a language. I think some people
Mm.
might resonate with that term to some extent, that it doesn't capture everything, but that gives you a gist of what it's about, isn't it?
Yep, and there's also I think it may have been Sapir who first used the term the genius of the
Ah,
language.
yes.
This idea that every language does have a, a feel to it,
Right.
and we can see this when we describe the language as a whole. And as a linguist, it may be the case that only when you really aim to describe the language as a whole, you start to see how all these things relate. And so it's in that respect, it really is a great exercise.
Certainly. Okay, so this is the PhD project, is to write this grammar. If I may
Mhm.
just back up a little bit. So you do your undergraduate where?
So that was at the University of Auckland, which is where I'm from. And so I did my undergraduate there, and I also did a Masters of Linguistics there. Um, and I was mainly focused on historical linguistics at that time. I was very interested in sort of reconstructing languages and so on in a very sort of abstract way. Um, and I had not encountered or really looked at any South American languages. Um, it wasn't until I started to consider the possibility of doing fieldwork, and started reading around. I realized, first of all, Amazonian languages were at the time quite quite mysterious. There was
Hmm.
still a lot of languages that hadn't really had a description by linguists, and there was sort of, if you could say, news coming out of South America. We'd found that these languages, once linguists did describe them, were doing things that linguists hadn't really expected languages to do. And so they were extremely interesting from that perspective.
Yeah.
I also, as a child, absolutely loved nature documentaries in particular. And so I'd always had this vision of I'd love to go and see Amazonia one day. And so they sort of those these two things came together. And I went, well, wait, I could do this, and do linguistics at the same time. So yeah, it was a dream come
Certainly.
true in two ways. Two dreams come true.
Yeah. Well, that certainly resonates with me. I used to watch nature documentaries sort of 24/7 as a child, and I do remember crying as a child watching the Amazon burn, on telly, right?
Mm.
You know.
Oh yeah,
So that, yeah, that's fascinating. So from historical linguistics, and then so it's the field work component that brings you to South America. And I have a hunch that that's a recurring theme for a lot of South Americanists,
mm,
is that,
I would imagine.
yeah, what's on
Yep,
the page is fascinating and inspiring and just arcane and wonderful, but you go, but there's a whole big world out there, and I'd love to see it, right? And I'd love to see how it works in
exactly.
this kind of ecology of the culture, and indeed natural ecology in general around the language that
Mm,
is the backdrop as well as the content.
exactly. Yep. And
Fascinating.
I mean it is a linguistically fascinating place, and my love for historical linguistics is very much fulfilled, because we've got all these languages that have been in contact historically, and sort of we still don't know a great deal about what the dynamics were there, and we're still trying to sort of piece that together. So it's a growth industry. There's still a lot to do.
Certainly. Well, so then having seen a bit about what the development that happened from bachelor's to master's, and then the pivoting point in a sense being that PhD, right? So then you go.
Mhm.
So what is this? You go to Australia then for your PhD, and
Mm.
this is to work with Dixon then.
Yes, my supervisors were Sasha Aikhenvald and Bob Dixon.
Right. Okay.
Um, so yes, both Sasha and Bob, who had done field work already on various languages, had their attention drawn to Amazonian languages, precisely because of these amazing linguistic, sort of oddities. It's not quite the word. Marvels is probably a better
Hmm.
word, that were found there, and they had co-edited in 1999 the Cambridge book of the Amazonian languages, which was a landmark, um, of description of these languages. And so I applied and was awarded a scholarship to go and work under the supervision of Sasha and Bob. And at that stage, it was still very, very sort of general. It was an Amazonian language. And they were based at the time at La Trobe University, the Research Centre for Linguistic Typology, which was at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. Yeah, so I moved there.
Right. And they've since, I mean, back then and since become incredibly prolific in the field of linguistics in general. And I think particularly Sasha Aikhenvald has had her name really sort of stand out as one of these, it appears on basically anything to do with Amazonia in some way or another, right, over the years.
Absolutely. Prolific authors, and Sasha is just she's amazing. She has read everything that has been published, and she has read most things that haven't been published yet. As it turns out, when she'll say, "Oh yes, I've just sort of someone was talking about this in a draft that they shared with me," and people send her things and get amazing comments from her. She's extremely generous with her time and expertise in that respect. Yeah. And so they've continued to pour out amazing publications. Absolutely.
Wonderful. So, okay, so you go to La Trobe, and then how early in that process did you decide to, because the PhD was on Awajún as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, sorry, perhaps you could actually just say first, so to move, just sidestep that slightly. So, in a sense, many of your publications have been related to this particular group, the Awajún or Aguaruna, sometimes called. Maybe if you could describe a little bit sort of their situation. Who are these people? Where do they live, and what are they about, in a sense?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So, the Awajún are an ethnic group of North Peru, and the language is spoken mainly in Amazonas region in North Peru, which is centered around the Marañón River and the Nieva River, if you have any sense of that area. I know you do, Austin. So Awajún, there would probably be about 60,000 speakers, I would guess. We get census data from time to time. They have censuses, and one of the questions that now in Peruvian censuses relates to ethnicity and to language spoken at home. So that's quite good information about numbers of speakers. So they're quite a decent sized group in terms of population. The Awajún, the language and culture are quite closely related to some other languages and cultures spoken in the same area and up into Ecuador. So there's One Piece, which is also spoken on the Santiago River in Peru, and then further north we've got the Shuar across the border in Ecuador, and then we have Achuar and Chiviar, which are spoken around the border area further east. And that whole group is known as the Chicham family. Now, terminology, or particularly naming, is always a fraught issue in Amazonian languages. I think in indigenous languages in general, because names get applied from outside, they're not always the names that people would prefer. Sometimes they're disrespectful, and so we end up with people changing names or whatever. So what we have in this case is the group was known as Aguaruna for a long time, which was sort of in Spanish, which was a name that had been applied to the group. There's no evidence that they'd ever really used that for themselves. And Awajún is a sort of nativization of that. And that's now the preferred term that's used in Peru for the people and for the language. So I started using Aguaruna because that was kind of the term that was used, and I'm shifting to use Awajún. In fact, the speakers themselves generally tend to use the term Iña, which roughly translates to something like from here or one of us. So the language generally gets referred to as Iña Chicham. The language family was formerly known as Jivaro or Jivaron, and This also was a problematic term, particularly in Ecuador. It took on quite racist connotations and became a quite disrespectful term to apply to people. So that has now been sort of abandoned, and anthropologists and linguists have committed to using Chicham as the name for the family, the language family, and also the group. Chicham is the word in all of the languages for language or word, so it's a perfect one, and it's easily pronounceable and easy to read. So pretty
Right.
happy with that choice.
User friendly for outsiders who aren't familiar with the language and are reading it in a book, let's say, to go, that was Chicham, this is this language family.
Exactly.
And as you say, is sort of nice in that we're using it for a language group and it means language. So that's in the language that is being described, which is
Exactly.
nice.
It's
Yeah, full
it's
circle.
appropriate in all ways.
Certainly. And I'm sure that anyone interested in looking up, of course, because of years of scholarship using the term of jibaro, or if people, might read it in more English or French, as jivaroan or something, perhaps
Mhm.
they may come across it like this. That they obviously they should know that that refers in theory more or less to the same thing, but as you say, has taken on some quite negative connotations, and we
Yeah,
no longer use that,
exactly.
but they'll see it in the
Exactly.
literature. So they should be aware that
Yes, yep,
that's talking about
certainly.
the same thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Brilliant. So, how long did you stay with them the first time? What did the first couple field trips look like? What were the tasks you were occupying yourself
Yeah.
with?
So Sasha and Bob had quite a quite a well-established system, um, which was, they would take on normally two PhD students per year, and everybody was doing the same kind of project. People were going to various parts of the world. And their normal system was you spend about 12 months total doing field work. So in the first year or so, you'd do a longer trip, which would be about 9 months, and then you'd have about a year of writing up, get a full draft of your description. You can see where all the gaps are. And then you'd go back for about 3 months, fill in those gaps, then come back and finish off your grammar, and boom, we're done. So well, I didn't know what to expect, obviously. I'd never been to South America before. In fact, I didn't speak Spanish. I hadn't studied Spanish. I'd studied Italian and French and Latin. And Sasha and Bob said, "Yeah, that'll be fine. You'll be all right." So off I went. I remember it was March when in March I moved to Melbourne and sort of started officially enrolled. And by June I was in a village in Peru, in an Awajún village, learning Spanish and Awajún in parallel. And I did pick up Spanish, so that, they were right about that.
Hmm.
What did the first trip look like? So the first trip, about 9 months. I was extremely lucky. The people had, sort of, I'd been in touch with people. They'd said they'd like a linguist to come and sort of look at the language and help them out with particularly regularization that they wanted to do in terms of doing translation and official publications or documents in the language.
Had
Um,
this community, sorry, had this community had any missionization beforehand?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So the Awajún community had missionization from SIL, and that started, I think the mission activity started around about in the 40s. And in fact, the Awajún were the first Amazonian community in Peru to have a bilingual school
Mhm.
established, which was a program that the SIL established bilingual schools throughout Peru eventually.
And
And
it
so
may
that
be
was in
helpful for listeners to know
1953.
that it's quite a large number of speakers for an Amazonian language, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is. Yeah.
So this
So
importance and
it's
this kind of prominence, as you say, this
yeah.
sort of stems from that in part too, right?
And there's been a culture for, for whatever reason, there's been a culture of being very politically active
Hmm.
among the Awajún and their neighboring groups. So right from the start of indigenous politics in Peru, the Awajún have been very central to that. and continue to be very politically active as a sort of cultural value, I think.
Hmm.
I guess this is described the earliest descriptions from the sort of colonial era of the Chicham peoples describe this love of independence, and they were always described as fierce warriors. They were famous, as you know, for the shrunken heads. That was the big thing that they became famous for, which obviously people don't do anymore. But the whole area had a great deal of conflict, largely due to colonization, in fact, and pressures of colonial systems, and also the rubber boom in the late 19th, early 20th century caused a lot of upheaval and social chaos in that area.
Certainly.
But
Well, I
yeah,
think
where was I
that's
going with that? Politically
excellent.
active.
Sorry,
Sorry, go.
absolutely. I was just going to say that, no, I think it's worth pointing out listeners may well be aware, they may not be, that exactly between colonization and as you say, the later rubber boom, where people are going in for rubber and enslaving indigenous people to tap rubber, is completely reorganizes so many things
Mm, mm.
in
Yep.
Amazonia, doesn't it? And we don't always know what things looked like before those times, always. Although sometimes we
No,
do.
absolutely not. And that's
Yeah.
something that I've more and more been aware of. And this is that, for example, I've recorded a lot of traditional stories. This was a big part of my first field trip. And just this also answers your previous question. A lot of what I did on the first trip was just recording people talking.
Hmm.
And what people generally wanted to do was, oh, let's get the elders, let's record traditional stories and songs. So that's what I have a lot of recordings of, and it's great for me. I can use that and look at the grammar, and it's also great for the people to have this record of these elders who a number of whom have now passed, of course. Well, I think
Certainly.
it was 20 years ago that I did my first trip, so it's been a time.
Yeah.
So in these traditional stories, in this sort of oral tradition, of course, a lot of this conflict has just been integrated into the tradition, of course. So we can be here recording these stories, looking at these stories, going, this reflects this ancient tradition. These people have lived here for many, many generations. It's not entirely clear even how long they've been in that particular area. But once we start to look with the knowledge that there has been this enormous social upheaval, we start to see signs of that, and we start to see this coming up in the stories, these sort of metaphors for that kind of colonial violence that people have undergone. And we also start to see in the linguistic situation where there's a lot of isolate languages that seem to be unrelated to any other language. Actually, maybe these are refugee populations originally. And of course, people's oral tradition aren't generally going to explicitly say, we're a refugee population who who have come from somewhere else and developed this culture. They're saying this culture has always been here. This is how
Hmm.
it's always been. That's how traditions generally work.
Right.
But the more we look, the more we can see that there must have been an enormous upheaval.
Certainly. Well, I'm with an eye on the time. It appears we have about 7 minutes
Mm,
left on the free version. Um, Perhaps we could move quickly then to what would you say have been therefore the highlights scholastically of working
mm,
with these populations, the Awajún, and then perhaps we'll have to save your other exploits for another time. Um,
mhm.
yeah, perhaps we could start there with
Yeah.
so what's made it
Um,
so interesting working with the Awajún?
mm. I mean, it's a really good question, and I love thinking about it. Academically, well, grammatically, I love morphology. That is the way words are put together and affixes and things. And Awahun, as it happens, has an enormous amount of morphology. So just from a pure sort of this is my personal taste and how I like to study language, it turns out to have been perfectly suited to me in that respect. So I've absolutely loved as an intellectual exercise working with Awahun. Um, all of that I've been talking about the history of the area is just fascinating. And I've loved discovering that. Even more so, I've absolutely loved having the opportunity to be immersed in Awajún culture. So it's been 20 years, visits as much as I can every couple of years normally. Um, and it's obviously I have friends now whom I've known for that long are now personal family friends, and I will always go and visit, and that's a wonderful thing. And seeing how people have sort of grown and developed. One of my closest friends, one of my first friends I made 20 years ago when I first went, is now mayor of the district. This politically active culture
Yes.
again. So it was wonderful to see him and to go and do some mayoral visits with him, which was quite fun. Um, yeah. So what have we got? We've got and the tradition. Yes, that's it. The more I've learned about the local area and also the traditions, the more now when I go to visit communities and so on, I can talk to people and quite quickly, people can get to know, oh, this guy already knows a bit about the culture. This guy's already sort of immersed enough, and then you can just get that much deeper and just listening to people tell these amazing stories and this amazing tradition and this feeling that people will entrust me with that culture is just a beautiful thing.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful. Absolutely. And of course, it's a different experience, I think, in some ways, but also the same in other ways, where with an Amazonian culture, it's not like going to a big nation state like, oh, Chinese culture, okay, I've been to China, 10 times, but I can always read about it in a book. There's always a video coming
Mm,
out of
mm.
there. There's a bit of this more and more with Amazonian cultures, but it's something that's very nice that it's very personal and you sort of need to be there
Yeah,
to really learn more.
I absolutely agree. Yeah. Yep, that is a big difference, and it's still a small enough group. Even if it's a huge group, but it's small enough that I certainly I meet people and I can kind of talk about who they're related to and so on, and go, oh yeah, I know such and such a person, and fit in, and exactly the sort of the traditional the way that people do this there. You sort of you find out who the people are in common that you know, and then you've got this link. It's a lovely thing.
Certainly. Well, I think looking at the time, that might be where to wrap this section up because that's a lovely sentiment to end on. So thank you very much. And well, as I say, we'll have to have you on again because there's so much more to talk about. But I hope this gives listeners a small window into both your career and also into this fascinating culture of Northwest Amazonia, the Awajún and the broader Chicham culture.
Thanks, Austin. Yeah, I would absolutely love to be on again because you know how I love to talk.
Never enough
And it's
time.
it's been wonderful. Thanks,
Oh,
thank you for giving me that opportunity, and I hope that people do sort of look afresh at indigenous Amazonian cultures and get a sense of what things are what's happening these days and how people are surviving and thriving in those cultures.
absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.